Thank you, Rabbi Greenblatt. Vershus. I could really cut out the first 5 minutes now because Rabbi Greenblatt anticipated many of the comments, but Chazor is good. Friday night, when this presentation was announced, someone came up to me and said, "Is it going to be a balanced program?" And I said, I can't claim to be unbiased, but I can promise to try to be objective. And part of that is because emes is emes, truth is truth. And if we have truth on our side, we shouldn't need to embellish, we shouldn't need to cherry pick facts, we shouldn't need to spin the topic or omit details. And also, it feels really good to preach to the choir. But ultimately, it doesn't accomplish much. The choir doesn't come away knowing anything that it didn't know before, and we don't have any impact on people who are not already invested. And part of the function of this program, as Rabbi Greenblatt said, is for us to know the answers for ourselves. But at the same time, exactly that same Mishnah, know how to answer an epikoros, know how to respond to a heretic. We need to know for ourselves, because otherwise those heresies will undermine and erode our convictions and our beliefs. But there are times when it is proper and necessary to respond to heresies, to inaccuracies, to misinformation and disinformation. One is that sometimes when people ask us questions, they're not really interested in the answer, and we're not going to convince them of anything, but they want to see if we have an answer. And if we don't, then they will use that to try to discredit us. So while we may not change their minds, we can at least demonstrate we do have coherent answers to their questions. And perhaps more important is that there may be people on the sidelines listening. And the people that are asking the questions or making assertions, we're not going to influence them, but we will be able to show others. And in fact, last week I was part of an online panel on growing anti-Semitism in America. And I spoke early on in the discussion, and I said that when you get into the question of a ceasefire, I said what the Palestinian civilians are going through right now is horrific. It's tragic, it's painful. It should end, it needs to end. But before we can talk about ending it, we have to ask ourselves 3 questions. First, why is it happening? Second, who is ultimately responsible? And third, what is the alternative? And when you find yourself in a situation where you have to engage people on these types of topics, the first thing to know is look for something that you can agree on. If you start off combative, then you're creating a relationship which is antagonistic. Whereas if you find something we can all agree on, yes, these people are suffering and it's terrible and something should be done, well, everybody can agree on that. Then I gain a certain amount of credibility to start making assertions that may not be universal. And the other thing you can do is to ask questions. Always if you can, put the other person on the defensive. Make them explain their position. Make them define their terms. And we'll talk about these claims of genocide and apartheid and occupation, these buzzwords that have become so popular. Asking people to define their terms. Some of you may have seen the video that was going around of a woman who was chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine should be free." And someone asked her, "Which river?" She gave a blank look. Huh? You said from the river to the sea. Which river? What difference does it make? We're not going to change her mind, but we're using her to discredit her whole philosophy. This is a person who clearly doesn't know what she's talking about. And that undermines the effectiveness of her message. And we can do it civilly and politely and thoughtfully. After this webinar I was part of, when it was done, I kind of had the feeling like not much was accomplished. But that evening, I got an email from a person who was in attendance, a non-Jewish person. And he said to me, "Thank you. Your words have lingered with me all through the afternoon and evening." If we can change one person's way of looking at the issue, that's a victory. Because that one person might be able to influence other persons. And a lot of us influencing one person at a time, a handful of people at a time, that can make a huge impact in keeping public opinion. We're very fortunate that at the moment, American public opinion is still largely on our side. And I engage in social media, perhaps more than I should, but it has been very encouraging for me, the outpouring of support and empathy and positive comments and gratitude for framing the issue in a way that people can understand it better from, literally hundreds of people, most of whom are not Jewish. So we have to keep control of the narrative, and that means we have to be informed. We have to practice being articulate. And we have to take advantages of these opportunities when they arise. Now, Rabbi Greenblatt mentioned the first pasuk in Chumash, first verse in Genesis, that Rashi brings Rabbi Yitzchak, who says, why does the Torah start with creation? Why not just jump right into the mitzvahs, the commandments? And he says, because the nations will come and they'll say, you were thieves, you stole the land. So what do we say? It's God's world. He can give it to whomever he pleases. Well, even for us, that needs some explanation. Does that mean it's a free-for-all? As long as God says it's okay, and we can do it? And certainly to articulate it to others, we need a more sophisticated approach. So there are three possible ways that one could claim ownership of land. I was there first, I'm there now, or I have a legitimate claim to it. So for most of human history, I'm there now was good enough for everybody. Might makes right. That was the way the world worked. Nobody talked about, you don't have the right to invade my territory. That's the way human beings and human empires operated. Now we consider ourselves more sophisticated, more civilized. We don't want to make that claim. So what if we go back to who was there first? And this begins to address the issue of who ultimately has the right to the land. There is this narrative that we've all heard that the Palestinian people have been there since time immemorial. And if so, clearly it's their land. Well, let's take a look historically exactly what is this term Palestine, where does it come from, and who has the right to the land? Well, the original occupants of the land, as far as history can tell, were the Canaanim, the Canaanites. So why don't we give it back to them? All right? That's pretty easy to deal with. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. Nobody today identifies themselves as Canaanim, so they're off the table. Who was there next? Us. We were there for over 800 years until conquered by the Babylonians, conquered by the Persians, conquered by the Greeks. We took back control for a brief period during the after the story of Hanukkah. Then by the Romans. The Romans occupied Israel for about 400 years. Then the Roman Empire split into the western and eastern parts. The eastern part became the Byzantine Empire. They ruled for about 300 years. Then the Muslim conquest. The Muslims ruled for 400 years or so, 450 years. until they were conquered by the Crusaders. That's another 200 years. The Egyptian Mamluks for over 200 years. The Ottoman Turks for 400 years. Yeah.
Can you define that as a country rather than a religion?
The Crusaders?
Yeah.
Well,
they're doing it in the name of Christianity, but before we're talking about countries, nations.
Yeah.
How would you define that? You said that the Crusaders were there for 300 years, 200 years.
That's maybe more history than we really want to get into. The Crusaders were European armies that were mandated by the Pope to go to whatever they called it back then, Palestine, Israel, and uproot the infidel Arabs that were living in the land. The Crusaders had a number of victories. What eventually happened is they built fortresses, and then most of the troops left. The Crusaders actually became prisoners in their own fortresses. So they were technically ruling the land, but they didn't actually have much in the way of control. The Egyptian Mamluks who eventually took it back from them were not technically Arabs. And then the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire fell late in World War I. The British army conquered their armies, took control of Israel. And after that, we have the League of Nations establishing what's called the Mandate for Palestine, which was intended, according to its claim, to determine how to enable the local Arab and Jewish populations to set up their own countries. Now let's go back a bit. This name, Palestine, where does it come from? The name Pelishtia, which comes from Philistine, was actually coined by the ancient Greeks. And it's kind of interesting because the Pelishtim themselves, the Philistines, they were not part of the 7 Canaanite nations. There was no commandment to drive them out of the land, which is why we read so much about them in the books of the prophets. They were themselves travelers. The word Pelishti, Philistine, it actually refers to a nomadic people. So even the name Palestine actually comes from a nomadic people who do not have roots. The name was used by the Romans after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, when the Jews were scattered. And the Romans were very clever about minimizing rebellion. And they played a lot of psychological games, one of which was to rename the country. If the name Israel is no longer in use, or the name Yehuda, Judah, is no longer in use, then the Jews have less to rally around. There's less motivation for them to try to reclaim their country because that country doesn't exist anymore. It's now Palestine. It's now Pelishtia. Even then, it was still mostly a Jewish population. The Romans exiled Jews. They brought other people in. You went through all of these different rules. And by the time the British took it over, you had a mixture. You had leftover Arabs who had immigrated there. You had Jews from Europe who had immigrated during the early days of the Zionist movement, which began in the 1880s. But at that point, prior to the British being there, the region was called Southern Syria. It was considered an extension of the Syrian Empire. And the Arabs who lived there, they considered themselves part of the greater Syrian Empire. And that was what they were looking forward to, being incorporated into Syria. Well, that plan fell apart in around 1920. That's when the French who were ruling the northern part, what is now Syria, they had a problem with King Faisal, who was the ruler of Syria at that point. They ousted him. They divided the territory. They kept control of the north. The British took control of the south. And all of a sudden, these Arabs who lived in the region that they were expecting to become part of Syria, well, that's not going to happen anymore. Because Syria is now a different territory, governed by a different rule. And so they had to devise some kind of a claim that they could make so that they could assert their right to stay in the land. So 1920 is when the concept of a Palestinian people actually came into existence. There was no mention of it before that. So when we hear this claim that they were indigenous to the land from time immemorial, not even close. Not even close. Now in 1921, under this League of Nations mandate, Colonial Secretary of Britain, who at the time was Winston Churchill, he divided this territory into two parts. And if you look on the map, on first map on page 2, this is what it looked like. They created a country called Transjordan, which was on the east side of the Jordan River. And they named the remaining territory Palestine. They gave Transjordan to the Arabs who lived in the region. And they said that they would determine how to divide Palestine between the Jewish and the Arab residents. Now, you can see just by looking at it, Transjordan makes up about 3/4 of the territory that was under dispute, 76% exactly. So there was already a division of the territory that was intended to be divided. 3/4 of it immediately went to the Arab population. I had a history teacher in high school. He said, imagine if Winston Churchill would have named this Palestine instead of Transjordan. Could have changed the whole narrative for the future. Because essentially that's what it was. It was a Palestinian state for Palestinian people. Well, that's not what happened. Over the course of the next 20 years, the British were not eager to give up control of this region. The Arab populations became more and more concerned that they would lose their claim to the land. The unrest grew. There are a number of riots, pogroms. I'm not going to go into those now. But eventually, the British formed what was called the Peel Commission.
But let me ask you just one question.
Yeah.
In those years when the Arabs wanted that part as well, is that territorial based or religion based? Were they saying this is our promised land? Because now it's, with the Muslims, with the...
Yeah.
How much of it is religious?
That's a good question. I don't think it was primarily religious based.
I think that's all late. I think that's all new stuff.
Yeah, again, the claim was always, we've been there since the beginning of recorded time.
It's important to know that.
They did a very effective job creating this fiction that they had been there. But if you look at the second map, the Pew Commission, based on their understanding of the demographics, split up the land. They gave the Arabs what is now called Gaza, what is now called by some the West Bank, and much of the north. Effectively, they gave the Jews 55% of the remaining 24%, which comes out to about 13% of the total land that was originally the British mandate for Palestine. Now, there's a famous rule in negotiation called 80-20. If you can get 80% of what you want, that's a win. They were offered 87% of what they wanted. They responded with riots and refusals. Along comes World War I, World War II. The whole plan gets put on hold until after 1945, 1946. And again, the Jews start lobbying for a state. And there was a certain amount of world guilt over the Holocaust that gave the Jews leverage to make a claim that was well received. It's really interesting, and it's not something to get into too much now, but the United Nations vote in 1947, the Jews kept delaying the vote because they didn't have the votes. There just weren't enough nations that were with them. They were close. They needed 2/3 of the General Assembly. The entire bloc of Arab nations was against them. There were a couple of nations that had large populations in Arab countries that were threatened, we're going to kill your people if you vote for Israel. The British didn't want it. At the last minute, for reasons that historians are still debating, the Soviet Union changed its vote to support Israel. As far as I know, there's no real good explanation. Why? Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah, but in terms of naturalistic explanation, it's really an open question. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to back up a little into something you said that the Jewish presence was from the early days of Zionist in the 1800s. There were two students of the Baal Shem Tov and students of the Gra came earlier.
Yes.
About how many of them were there and how significant was it?
I don't know those numbers. When the Ramban came to Jerusalem in, I think it was 1263.
They didn't find a minyan.
Yeah, he couldn't get a minyan. That was Jerusalem. But it gives you some idea of how sparsely. Yes, we know that the students of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, came, but the real numbers began to grow in 1881 with the Chivat Zion movement. They actually bought land. They raised, that was the Jewish National Fund, to actually buy land in order to establish a greater legal claim, kind of like Avram buying up the burial site for Sarah. In 1947, the vote passed. The United Nations voted the state of Israel into existence. And the Jews were not happy with the partition plan. It was much smaller. It was lacking a lot of, it was mostly desert. But they were willing to take what they could get. The Arabs rejected it. And together with surrounding armies, attacked the Jews. We know the story. A miraculous victory over overwhelming numbers and armaments. But of course, that wasn't an end to the story. You had the Suez War in 56, you had the Six-Day War in 67, you had the Yom Kippur War in 73, you've had the Lebanon Wars, we've had various challenges with Gaza. It has not been a particularly peaceful presence in the land. But what I want to get into now is another issue is refugees. Right? The claim that the Jews displaced, and the numbers range between 540,000 and 720,000. I'm on page 3 now if you want to follow along. What exactly is the status of these Arabs who had lived in what is now Israel, that fled during the 48 war? Well, apparently there are 4 categories. There were affluent Arabs who just left early because they wanted to protect their wealth. They took their wealth with them and they left. There were calls by the Arab leadership for Arabs to leave the land so that the armies could drive out the Jews, and then those Arabs would be able to return to their properties. Now, this is a very interesting subject. It's widely cited in our circles. It is also widely debated about just how many Arabs responded to these calls to leave. I'm not a historical researcher. I did my best to look and to find sources, and historians themselves argue. I did find a fascinating quote. I think it's on page 4. Yeah, it's a quote by the Prime Minister of Syria in 1948 and 49. I won't try to pronounce his name. Who published his memoir in 1973. And apparently he says as follows: "We have brought destruction upon 1 million Arab refugees by calling upon them and pleading with them to leave their lands, their homes, their work, and their business. And we have caused them to be barren and unemployed though each one of them had been working and qualified in a trade in which he could make a living." Now, when he says 1 million, it wasn't 1 million refugees actually living, because nobody says the number was that high. But these Arabs who fled, they were put in refugee camps, and they were kept there for decades. I'm not even sure what their status is anymore. Nobody talks about them anymore. So I'm not even sure where they are, what their status is, but literally for decades. And the population swelled. I think it was estimated at 5 million about 20 years ago. And what we're reading here is an actual claim by an Arab leader that many of them did leave in response to this urging by Palestinian, by not non-Palestinian Arab leaders, in order that they be able to get out of the way. We'll kill the Jews, we'll drive them into the sea, we'll take back the land. Now, if you go back to page 3, there are a couple of other interesting quotes here. In 1960, towards the bottom, King Hussein of Jordan admitted that Arab leaders have approached the Palestinian problem in an irresponsible manner. They have used the Palestine people for selfish political purposes. This is ridiculous and, I could say, even criminal. This is the King of Jordan looking at it. Was always a useful bargaining chip. Look at all these poor Palestinians who are suffering in refugee camps, languishing, living in poverty and squalor, and Israel won't let them back. Right? There were repeated overtures to negotiate a peace deal. At one point, I think it was more than one point, in 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered to return 94% of the West Bank of Yehud and Shomron to the PLO. What was the reason for not accepting it?
The 6%.
It was actually more than that. It was the demand that all those Palestinian refugees should be incorporated back into Israel. Well, what would that do? Now Palestinians would become a majority in the land, claiming citizenship. It would no longer be a Jewish state. So it was unfeasible for that and for other reasons. President Bill Clinton said to Arafat at the time, "You are leading your people and the region to a catastrophe." After Yasser Arafat died, I believe it was the European Community, they offered his widow $2 billion to return all the funds that had been given to the Palestinian Authority to help the Palestinian people. Now, if you're paying $2 billion to have funds released, I think the estimates were around $30 billion in funds that were embezzled. And this applies there. It applies all the more so to Gaza. And Gaza was, the Gazans were given their own country in 2005 when Israel unilaterally withdrew. Tens of billions of dollars.
The amount that Obama put on pallets for the is it $2 billion like a magical number?
It's above my pay grade. All that money, it's been observed by many that Gaza could have been a Singapore. It could have been a Dubai. They had all of these agricultural greenhouses and infrastructure that they could have used to support their people. That infrastructure was largely destroyed in fits of rage. We're going to destroy every vestige of the Israeli presence here. And the monies that were given were used to build tunnels. There's one report going around, I don't know if it's true, but they said that if they would actually blow up all the tunnels in Gaza, the entire country would collapse. But it has been reported that it's more intricate than the New York subway system. All this money that could have been used to support these people, that hasn't been. That was used instead to perpetuate terror. And down on the bottom of page 3, one more quote from the Egyptian foreign minister at the time, who told a Cairo journal that in demanding the return of the Palestinian refugees, the Arabs mean their return as masters, not slaves. Or to put it quite clearly, the intention is the termination of Israel. So these people have not been shy about articulating their dream, which is to destroy Israel. They've refused peace overtures repeatedly. They clearly don't want peace, and we'll get more into this later. But another aspect, well, let's finish up with the refugees. From what I could glean from a digest of the historical opinions, it's possible that the majority of Arabs who left Israel in 1948 left because of the war, not in anticipation of the war, but because of the war. They simply didn't want to be in the middle of a battlefield. And they felt it was safer for them to cross the border into lands that were Arab-ruled than to stay in Israel and perhaps get caught in the crossfire. And then it's true, apparently, that some Arabs were forcibly expelled. As best I could determine, it's a relatively small minority. The problem is there just don't seem to be reliable numbers on these types of things. But clearly there was a call by Arab leaders for Arabs to leave the region. Clearly many of them fled because they were afraid during the war. And clearly some left because they were wealthy. Now, the number, let's call it somewhere around 600,000 probably. What you don't often hear about is the Jews who fled Arab lands for Israel. 860,000, more than the highest estimate of Arabs who left Israel. There has been no discussion that they should be compensated. They left most of them left their wealth behind. So the unwillingness of the Arab countries to patriate these Arab refugees is quite glaring in contrast to the 860,000 Jews who became part of Israel.
Rabbi, on that Jewish side, what percentage were forcibly expelled versus voluntarily left?
I don't know. I think that virtually all of them left because of fear of persecution. If you look on the last page, there's an interesting chart here. And I think this chart may actually be a little outdated. I think the numbers may actually be lower. But when you look at the Jewish populations in Arab lands in 1948, in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and you look over to the figures for 2018, where in many cases it's double or triple digits, and nothing more than about 2,000. This really starts to get into the topic of apartheid. And this is a place where it's important to ask people to define their terms. Apartheid is an interesting word. It's used quite a bit, and it's used nowadays largely inaccurately. Apartheid is a state in which different groups, usually based on ethnicity, have different sets of rights. And the most obvious example in recent history is South Africa. The whites in South Africa were the ruling party, the ruling government. The whites had rights, the blacks didn't. And it was really as simple as that up until the apartheid government was ousted and Nelson Mandela came in and turned the country into a more equal society. But
You didn't say better.
I didn't. Well,
We could talk to Leo.
I'll leave that for. Certainly, there were. Well, let's not get that. So, is Israel an apartheid state? Well, if it were, then you would have to explain a number of phenomena in Israel today. There is Arab representation in the Israeli parliament. They participate in the government. In fact, they were part of the last ruling government. There have been 2 Arab deputy prime ministers, an Arab Supreme Court justice, an Arab national soccer team captain, an Arab Miss Israel. This is not indicative of apartheid. And you can go online and you can find Israeli Arabs making videos, writing articles, talking about how they are fortunate, they feel fortunate to live in Israel because they have freedom. Now, there is a certain sort of self-segregation, right, that most communities, or at least many communities in Israel, are either predominantly Jewish or predominantly Arab. There are cultural reasons for that. But at the same time, hang on, let me find my statistics here. Israeli Arabs have greater prosperity, meaning income, lifestyle, literacy, medical care, life expectancy, did I say that? Child mortality, lower child mortality rates, across the board, higher in Israel than any of the surrounding Arab
Are
nations.
you talking about all of the Arabs in Israel? I don't mean just about Haifa Arabs, we're talking about West Bank?
Well, we're talking about Israeli Arab citizens in Israel.
Arab citizens?
Right. Now, the West Bank is, that's also kind of interesting when you get into the apartheid discussion,
You gotta talk
right?
about that.
Because Jews are not, if you drive in Israel and you get anywhere near the West Bank, you're going to see these big signs saying, do not enter. What we're calling the West Bank was mostly given over to control of the Palestinian Authority, and they are under their own rule. We're not really talking about that, because Israel doesn't have any real control over that region. So what's going on there, that's not really part of our discussion. We're talking about the Arab citizenry of Israel, which I think is about 2 million. Maybe not quite that high. But it's significant. And they have all the rights of any other people in any other nation. They are legal equals to the Jews who live in Israel, and they are living much better than their fellow Arabs outside of Israel and the surrounding countries. Yeah.
I think Israel has the rights to build infrastructure in the West Bank.
Yeah.
To Alan Dershowitz, he answered, if you draw a graph of the number of people, number of roads, people with running water, people with electricity, number of universities, number of hospitals that existed in the West Bank. Prior to 1967, which is after, the truck goes like this, and Israel has built a whole infrastructure on the West Bank for about centuries. Right? And that's how you define apartheid, that you create an infrastructure for life to improve the quality of living, and that was his counter to this.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that certainly is worth being aware of, that the quality of life of Arabs in the West Bank is also higher than surrounding. I don't have statistics on that. But as much as that's true, and as important it is to acknowledge that, those Arabs are not under Israeli rule. They're not part of the state of Israel. They are an autonomous political entity. So apartheid isn't even relevant from that point of view. Yeah.
An argument that I've made with regard to this, and I'd like your opinion on it, is just simply that in South African apartheid and in the Jim Crow South in the United States, there were literally two sets of laws. There were signs all over the place saying,
Yeah.
this is for whites, this is for blacks, this beach is for whites, this beach is for blacks, etc. There's nothing like that in Israel
Right.
that segregates people in this way.
Right,
And
right.
those are the features of apartheid.
Well, exactly. And what you do, and what their claim is that they have separate housing and separate. But again, that is largely self-segregation. Now, I mean, there's nothing on the books, and you know, if an Arab wants to buy an apartment in Harnof, I don't know if there's any. I don't believe there's any legal issue with that happening. They might not be comfortable there. Of course, secular Jews might not be comfortable there either. That's,
Feeling.
there you go. Yeah.
Taking it back a little bit, but you talked about the Suez War in '57.
Yeah.
I know nothing about it, and it's not talked about widely.
Yeah. It's. I don't want to get into it here. There was actually an era. I think it was largely the Egyptian blockade of what is it? The Straits of Tiran? Is that what's down there? Going to Eilat, and there was kind of an interesting historical context because Israel actually went to war over that, but they did it in collaboration with the British and the French. So it was a much different type of situation, but it was still provoked by Egyptian attempt to interfere with trade that Israel needed, or commerce and imports that Israel needed for its economic security. Yeah.
Yeah, let me go back to the 48 war, 47 war. We know that at that time, a number of Arab nations attacked the nascent country of Israel. But the Palestinian Arabs inside that area, we know some of them left because they wanted to or they didn't want to. What about the ones that stayed? Did they form a resistance? Did they join the Arab armies? What did they do?
I don't know. I haven't seen that discussed or haven't investigated that. I think that, well, I don't want to speculate on something I don't know. But certainly, once the war was over, any Arabs that were living in Israel at the time automatically became Israeli citizens.
You mentioned before, that's just the way of the world. One country conquers another, no one ever, doubted that, right?
Yeah.
So that needs to be really understood. How even America, was opposed to the settlements, and it's land that we were under attack. We had to defend ourselves, and we have the West Bank, and we put up settlements. In other words, we're not occupiers, and this needs to be really fleshed out also.
Yeah, and the settlement issue, I don't want to get into too much because I might say something that people don't like. My wife and I owned an apartment in Neve Yaakov at one time. It's over the Green Line. It's in the West Bank. It is a settlement from that point of view. There are really two types of settlements. There are the ones that naturally... Mater Shkol, Pisgat Zev, there are plenty of them. They're natural... we used to joke, because we used to look across this valley from Neve Yaakov to Pisgat Zev. Say, well, one of these days, these two neighborhoods will run into each other. Well, it happened a long time ago. Dallas and Fort Worth. Eventually there's nowhere to go. So that is a natural expansion, and it's entirely defensible. Some of the settlements are set way out in areas, and you can. I think there's a lot of religious zealotry that motivates some of this. We have to take the land, we have to control it. I think some of it is meant to be provocative. I know when I was there a few years ago, when my son was doing his army service, they had just removed one of these settlements. It was something like, I think it was less than 100 people that had set themselves in this place that was they needed a full-time contingent of soldiers to protect them. It was really unfeasible for them to be doing anything there except just sort of making a statement, and the government forcibly removed them. I think that there has to be a certain awareness of, we have to live in a world. Yes, this is our land. God promised it to us, but we still have to live in the world of politics. What's that expression? Realpolitik. A lot of it goes to the land for peace debate. On the one hand, we're not supposed to give up Eretz Yisrael. What I remember hearing from my Rebbeim many years ago is that if giving up land would in fact provide peace, that there would be a halakhic basis for doing that. The problem is that no matter what we offer, no matter what we give, there is no real desire for peace. And that kind of brings us into the whole issue with Gaza. We withdrew. We gave them a place that could have been enormously successful and prosperous. And at first, that was the whole intent, is that Gazan Arabs could come into Israel, could do their jobs in the way that many Palestinian Arabs do from the West Bank. But once Hamas gained control, and their whole agenda was to perpetuate conflict between them and Israel, it's hard to know how to resolve this kind of situation, especially when you look, and you can find this stuff online. It's horrifying. We think about American kids growing up with Sesame Street. They are watching these cartoons where the theme is the Jews are evil, Israel has taken our land, we need to kill them because they want to kill us. And when you grow up in a society like this, I mean, our great hero, the founder of Judaism, is Abraham. Right? He lived in a society where everybody worshipped Avodah Zarah, everybody worshipped idols. And he was able to ask a question. Maybe there's nothing to this. Maybe there's a different way. Maybe there's another basis for this. How many Abrahams were there? Yeah. One. So how can we expect these people growing up on this narrative of hate and this false narrative of oppression and persecution and genocide, how can we expect them not to see us the way they see us? So how do you make peace with people like that? I mean, isn't this what Amalek is about? Right? Why can't we make peace with Amalek? Because they want to kill us, and you can't make peace with people who want to kill you. Now, it's interesting, and I don't know if this is universal among all of the poskim, but there's plenty of evidence that somebody in the Amalek can leave. Right? The sons of Haman, they converted to Judaism. If they were Amalek, how could they do that? Because if you leave the society and you disassociate yourself from the philosophy of that society, then you're no longer considered Amalek. There are Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, who repudiate Hamas, but they have to do it very quietly, because if they do it publicly, they're putting their lives in danger. And it's and the fact that the other Arab nations do not want to take these Palestinians is an indication that they see them as a dangerous element. If you look up a woman online, her name is Brigitte Gabriel, a Lebanese Arab Christian who describes what she and her family, what she lived through growing up when Palestinians came into Lebanon and basically destroyed the country. Lebanon was at one time called the Paris of the East. And we know it's not that anymore. If you can't make peace with a people, if they are determined to kill you, your options are limited. And attempting to make peace is simply going to leave you vulnerable to future attacks, which is what we've seen here. It's a very difficult situation. We want to be sympathetic to civilians. We want to acknowledge that their beliefs aren't genuine. When my son was in the army, he was on the Syrian border, and every night they would open the border and they would let in Syrians who were wounded in the war going on there for treatment by Israeli and international doctors. And he said he watched this. He watched one Syrian would be literally dragging another one in. And the one being dragged in was wounded, needed treatment, saying, "No, don't take me to those Israelis. They'll kill me." And the one doing the dragging is saying, "No, I thought that too. But they saved my life and they'll do the same for you." This is the cultural mindset that we're up against. And it creates a tremendous impediment for any kind of resolution. Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask the truth on some. One, Gaza was Hamas was elected by the guys.
They were elected,
They were brought into office by an election.
but then they canceled all elections after that.
Okay.
So yes, they did make promises.
I believe there was statistics that most of the Gazans supported the October 7th massacre.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly my point. Is that when you grow up in a culture of hate,
You know what the
You think that
stats
way.
on that were?
what's that?
You know what the stats on that were?
I also heard 70%, but Will Rogers said, "All I know is what I read in the papers," and we know how reliable the papers are. It's very difficult to get reliable information. Yeah.
The question going back to pre-1948 and the composition of the indigenous Arab population that actually existed. They claim that they're a cohesive people, and they say that because of they don't care what colonial influences have come in and renamed them or imposed artificial borders. They say my family's been here forever, so all this colonial stuff doesn't mean anything to them, and these historical arguments are hard to make with them. So do we have a good grip on the actual composition of this population, whether they were really from other countries and they came 100 years ago, 50 years ago? They want to say they were there from time immemorial, but what was the composition of this group?
Well, I mean, they certainly were not there before the Christian era began, because up until then it was the First Temple Commonwealth, the Second Temple Commonwealth, the Roman Empire. I don't think that there was any significant Arab population until the Muslim conquest in the 600s. Now, how many of those invading Arabs chose to stay? Because the Muslims were not occupiers, they were conquerors. And they conquered almost the entire world south from the Mediterranean south, from Spain to India, almost in one generation. It was one of the most extraordinary historical phenomena you can look at. But they would just conquer and go further, and they would appoint tax collectors to give them tributes, and and I suppose gradually that expansion petered out, and some of them stayed in the conquered territories. But so I think you can safely say that before the middle to late 600s, there was no significant Arab population there. But even if they were, there you have Jews that could trace their families in Israel back 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. It doesn't really mean anything on a national level. Go wherever our families, however long we've been in America.
There's no governance.
Yeah.
Right. See, that's what I meant earlier. To me, I think the only thing that resonates with some people is the religious claim. Whether we live there or not, what are we saying? We're saying that Eretz Yisrael is ours, the mission was that it was totally desolate for 1,000 years, but it's our land, right? In other words, they could use the same claim. They want to say that the main son of Abraham is Ismail, not Isaac, right? So
Yeah.
it's the same thing once you enter that into the argument. Now, one other thing, I find this very interesting. What leg does Israel have to stand on as far as the world is concerned for the right to exist? The UN. Is that
Right.
great, right? that's the same UN that's our biggest enemy today. That is, you're going to use the UN to say, well, the UN gave us the kind of what UNs are telling you now to the whole thing is so fickle.
Well, that's true, but at least it gives us a claim to legitimacy on their terms,
On whose terms?
on the world community terms. Right?
Yeah.
The United Nations gave us this land.
Let's say they had to take a vote again today.
That may be true. And that's why we should be grateful for the United States having veto power and still being on our side. So my wife asked me, is what's going on now like the Holocaust? And I said, not really, because that was government sponsored. When that happens, then we really need to get words, or God forbid. And it's just, I think
Well,
it's,
if the squad membership grows in the Congress.
well, yeah, but I think for now, there's a lot to be grateful for. Public opinion is largely on our side. Government support.
Except in the universities.
Well, yeah, and that's cause for concern, because in 20 or 30 years, those are the people going to be running the country. Just a couple of last points. The term genocide, which we hear a lot, ironically, I can't claim to know the statistics on this, but it has been said that the Gazan population has doubled in the last 20 years. That doesn't sound like genocide. Genocide population gets smaller; they don't get bigger. Also, Israel acts in a way that is unlike any army in the world, making phone calls to tell people that they're going to attack, dropping leaflets. At times, not so much in time, but at times they've fought door to door, knowing that there are booby traps, rather than simply bombing buildings to protect civilian populations. No army in the world does this. On the other hand, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is clearly a call for genocide, the extermination of Jews. And it's not just happening in Israel. The anti-Semitism around the world. You hear the same chants. You hear we could go into those stories. But, and then there's the question of media bias. Why is the media so tilted against Israel? And I think that's kind of easy to answer. The world has become very superficial. People love to indulge in binary thinking. If it's black and white, I don't have to think too much. I don't have to make too many decisions. I don't have to grapple with complex issues. And if we can reduce everything to the matter of oppressors and oppressed, then all the narratives just fall right into line. And we see it with social issues. We see it with race issues in our country, America. And we see it with the Israeli-Arab conflict. Israel is a first world nation. It is successful. It is relatively wealthy. And the Palestinians are suffering. And when you slot that into the narrative of oppressor versus oppressed, there's only one way to view that in their minds. And then everything has to fit that narrative. Somebody said, we no longer live in a world of fact-based decisions. We live in a world of decision-based facts. And once we know what we want to believe, we will fit everything into that narrative. And all we can do is to try to deal with people on an individual basis. Talk to people you know. My wife works in Ladue Middle School, and she says the outpouring of support for her among her fellow teachers is overwhelming. And I think it's because she's been there for 20 years, and they know her, and they like her, and they know she's a good teacher, and they know that she does a good job for the students. And therefore, there's a personal investment to see things from her point of view. When we use our relationships to let others know, to understand a little bit better, we can make a difference. And sometimes, it's like couples counseling. You practice the conversations you want to have with each other, so that when you get in a fight later, you'll have the muscle memory, so to speak. It's worth having these discussions with each other. Role play. There are a few resources I just want to point you to. A fellow by the name of Sam Harris. I'm not a fan. He's He calls himself one of the new atheists. But he wrote an article called The Sin of Moral Equivalence, and he does a masterful job highlighting the difference between Israel's actions towards Gaza and Hamas' actions towards Israel. The Sin of Moral Equivalence. If you're on TikTok, which I don't necessarily recommend, there's a woman there who calls herself the Jewish Ginger, and she has a video where she takes his article and highlights the main points. Really does an astonishing job. It's something you can send people that they can watch for 4 minutes and get a really clear sense. Yeah?
What was the name of the person that you mentioned, the first?
Sam Harris is the Sin of Moral Equivalence.
A few years ago, they asked Thomas Sowell in an interview, could the Jews do anything to stop this anti-Semitism? He says yes. Fail.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
fail.
it's that narrative of,
The interviewer says, well, if it's a choice between failing and being loved and succeeding and being hated, I'll go for success and succeeding and being hated.
yeah, that's that same narrative. And, it's been said that the Asians are the new Jews. They're people of color. They're a minority. They should tick all the boxes to get all kinds of support. But they've committed the sin of succeeding. And now they're suffering some of the same kinds of, not the same degree, but the same kinds of persecution we are. There's a woman named Meira Cowland. She's on Instagram. She goes by the real Meira. Extremely articulate, defending Israel.
What's her name?
Meira Cowland. She's actually been picked up by some of the more conservative podcasts and news shows. Cowland.
Could you explain? I just don't understand or get a grasp on the country Qatar. I can't even pronounce it.
Yeah, I think that's right, Qatar.
Who are they? What are they? They're supporting. Is it a terrorist state? It's not a terrorist state. What?
Military bases there. We actually have military bases.
We have military bases in Gaza, but yet
They're
they're
like an ally, but they're-
Oh, we have one in Cuba. We have one in Cuba too.
the leaders of Hamas are leading their luxury. What is it like a Kalayan society there? A Kalayan?
It's the Arab world is really fascinating. What's going on there? You have the UAE, the Emirates, and Bahrain, who have basically repudiated the Palestinians completely. They were part of the Abraham Accords. They're interested in making money. I don't think they love us, but they see Israel as a big trading partner, and they want a stable region where they can make more money. And then I think their foreign minister, the Emirates foreign minister, a long time ago actually, denounced. Well, he denounced Hamas as a terrorist organization.
Also, Egypt to me is like a chameleon. In other words,
Well, yeah.
you got what are they really all about? The Egyptians here, you had the Sadat era.
Well, he was
they
the.
don't open up their borders for the Arabs, for the Palestinians.
Well,
They're
but none of them do. Yeah, remember Sadat launched the Yom Kippur War, and then he turned around 8 years later, and 6 years later, and made the first peace treaty, which got him assassinated. I think that I remember I read his autobiography when I was in college. Apparently, it was the same type of thing. It's just not viable to be at odds with Israel. And then, so you always have the question of ideology versus self-interest. Right? Hamas clearly is more interested in ideology, although when you look at the leaders, they're doing just fine. If I can live in a different country in my penthouse and have my son drive a Ferrari, what do I care if my people are dying and living in squalor? Yeah.
Also, the elephant in the room that you didn't mention at all is Iran.
Well,
Because it's so obvious.
yeah, that's a little beyond our scope.
I guess everybody here remembers when they overthrew the Shah.
Yeah.
The whole the religious fervor. That really was a turning point in the history of the Middle East and the World War II.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it.
Religious fervor caught on.
Yeah, and the really sad thing is that the sanctions that were put in place against Iran, according to reports, were working, and they were really on the ropes. until a certain president decided that apparently what we really needed to do was show them how nice we are, and release these frozen funds, and then the sponsor of terror just started up all over again. Yeah.
You're being kind.
I'm just wondering, from your perspective, just tactically, when you're discussing these issues with someone who's pro-Palestinian, perhaps Muslim as well, certainly in the hospitals, the medical system here in St. Louis, there are many Muslims. So these kind of conversations are not rare. What are the arguments that you found to be most successful? And I'm wondering, is it ever wise to take it to a religious level, to the real underpinning? And just for example, pointing out the fact that the Muslims wouldn't tolerate, anything more than a superior type of status, not a inferior status in any sort of arrangement, and that they feel that this land, once Islamic, is always Islamic, and they have certain religious principles that they can't back down from it. Even if they're relatively moderate, they might agree that they religiously can't, so does it ever make sense to go there with them?
I think unless you really want to spend your time studying Islam, there are moderate Muslims who don't support this and don't want it. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote a book called Not in God's Name. And he was speaking on one occasion, and this Muslim couple came up to him afterwards, and he was thinking, what's going to be? And the wife said to him, thank you so much for your book and for everything you do. We need somebody to help us present ourselves as moderate to the world, because the whole world thinks we're extremists and fanatics and jihadists, and we're not. But remember, you've got over 1 billion Muslims in the world. So even if only 2% of them are radicalized, that's still over 20 million people. 20 million people can do a lot of damage. So, I don't know what to say about engaging on that level. And again, go back what I began with, that some people, you're never going to change their minds. And there's no point in trying to change their minds. It's just if there's someone around who's susceptible to you or to them, that's when I think it becomes more imperative to intervene. And a lot of it, as we said before, it's asking questions. If you can have some facts on your side, some history on your side. A lot of people really have no clue. You may have seen this video of a person going around on a college campus asking students to sign a petition in support of the Hamas Charter. And these students said, yeah, absolutely. Said, well, we have a policy where you have to know what you're signing. And they'd read them, what's in the Hamas Charter? I don't want to sign that. But why don't they ask first? There's a kind of willful ignorance that we're up against.
And there's another interview that's going around that would ask man or woman, a gay person. Today you don't know if it's a man or woman anyway. So,
yeah.
Whose side are you on? Hamas, Palestinian. Says, let me show you. Let me play something for you. And they played. They asked Palestinians, "What would you do if there were gays in your country?" And they said, "We'd kill them all." And so then they asked it. So he said, "Oh, I didn't know that. I'm on Israel's side."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just show the facts.
Yeah. These people make their opinions.
Facts, man,
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. One more question.
Yeah, so it's not about the land, it's not about Israel. It's how we tell them that after us is them. It's all individuals that Hamas wants, all of this. And there won't be an after us. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying for them to.
No, for them, no, absolutely.
There
And
was that minister that said, I didn't go out and help the Jews when it was
Right.
the Jews, and then the Catholics, and then they came for me because there was no way to
Yeah.
help me.
yeah, Martin
So
Niemöller.
the point is that somehow we have to get the narrative to the fact that it's not about the land, it's about all the entire world's infidels
Yeah.
versus Hamas.
I heard Malcolm Heinlein say that years ago. Malcolm Heinlein, I heard say this yesterday. He said it's not Israel, it's blue jeans.
He was here in St. Louis when he said that, and then Epstein did
Yeah.
It was very alarming.
Yeah. Somebody else you should look up is Douglas Murray. He's not Jewish. He is extremely articulate and a passionate defender of Israel and what's going on right now.
And
So that,
gentle and sweet, and doesn't.
well, he's not always gentle and sweet, but yeah.
How many people watch? Can you raise your hand if we, just raise your hand.
Anyway, thank you all.
Just a second, thank you very much, Mike Olson, for a very informative, insightful presentation, and you like me, I'm sure everyone else.